"You don't look like someone who belongs here." Those were the first words the woman in the security booth said as Elijah Ross rolled down his window. Before his full greeting could even form, her judgment had already landed. She narrowed her eyes, her voice clipped and firm as she leaned forward, scanning the interior of his aging sedan like it was out of place. Embedded in her gaze was something sharper than suspicion, certainty. Not curiosity about who he was, conviction that he did not belong. Elijah calmly offered a warm smile and stated his reason for being there. He was picking up his daughter from a birthday party. He even gave her the exact address and the host family's name. But the woman, her name tag read Brenda, didn't check the guest list, didn't call. She simply asked for his driver's license and then held it longer than necessary, eyes darting between the identification and his face. Then she muttered something under her breath as she reluctantly began keying into her tablet. Elijah had been through this before, not always with such clear hostility, but always with that same edge, that subtle question loaded into every look. "Are you who you say you are?" He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, watching the late afternoon sun cast long rays over the gated community behind Brenda's booth. Cozy cul-de-sacs wrapped around fountains and trimmed hedges. Houses looked cloned from architectural magazines. Safety and serenity priced by zip code. His daughter, Amari, had been thrilled for this party all week. Her classmate Ava lived in one of these houses. "They have a trampoline and Peppa Pig-shaped cookies," she'd squealed that morning, jumping into her pink dress. Elijah worked a long shift but moved mountains to make it here right on time. He didn't rush through 12 hours of shift management at the logistics warehouse just to be told he didn't belong. Brenda still hadn't made the call. "Can you step out of the vehicle for a moment?" she asked, not as a request, but as a protocol she'd already decided applied to men like him. "So, where are you from? Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word?" Hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. Below the surface of Elijah's calm expression, something stirred. Not anger. He had long since mastered that, but a quiet expectation of what comes next. Brenda was pulling something he'd seen many times before, the kind of slights people pretended were policies. He considered refusing, but his daughter was waiting, so he eased open the car door and stepped into the warm air. His back straight, voice steady, nothing to prove. Brenda called someone this time, but not the host family. She called the community's supervisor. Elijah heard bits of the conversation through the cracked booth window. "Yeah, we've got someone saying he's here for a kid's party. Said it's number 47. Black male. No, I didn't see any invite. No mention of the ID she'd been given. No mention of Elijah calmly producing the text message thread from Ava's mom confirming the time and address. He stood quiet, not wanting to make a scene, just needing to get to his daughter. But the delay grew longer. Another white SUV cruised up behind him and rolled down a window. The driver waved at Brenda, who instantly opened the gate for them without so much as a pause. The driver didn't even have to stop fully. Brenda knew them or didn't feel the need to know them. Elijah watched the SUV cruise past like a reminder of the rules being applied outside the booth. A game where the pieces moved for some and froze for others. A few minutes later, a woman in a blazer, Karen Walsh, arrived out of breath, flustered as if this situation had demanded her urgent attention. She introduced herself as site manager of the Riverside Gate Access Control. Her eyes scanned Elijah briefly, then moved past him, as if still trying to locate the supposed threat. Brenda quickly explained what was happening. A visitor with incomplete verification, that something felt off, and that this black man in the older car didn't seem to know the names of any other guests. "I told him to step out of the car just in case," Brenda said proudly, as if she'd intercepted a potential breach. Elijah finally spoke again, his voice low and precise. "I told you who I was here for. I gave identification. The ride is simply my daughter's favorite because of the stickers she put on the dashboard." Karen nodded mechanically, then turned to Brenda. "Did you say he has no invite?" "He says he was invited, but it might be a misunderstanding. They do that sometimes," Brenda whispered, not low enough. "They do that." The phrase landed like a slap. It wasn't personal, it was policy disguised as instinct. A practiced sort of profiling that people like Brenda and Karen felt justified in using because they believed it kept places like this safe. Elijah didn't carry rage in his pocket, not anymore. He carried patience. But moments like this still wounded, subtly and deeply, especially because of what they signaled to his daughter, that safety was only extended to some, not all. Behind him, another vehicle had pulled up. The traffic into the community was now backed up, drivers looking confused at the delay. A small voice inside Elijah whispered that someone out there was likely filming. Another voice told him it wouldn't matter. Perception would override proof, as it always did. Karen reached for the walkie clipped to her belt. "We may need to call local dispatch just to be sure," she said, almost casually. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying her face. She didn't sound cruel. She just sounded convinced. That's when he realized it wasn't just Brenda's burden anymore. This was a systemic ritual they were performing. One leaning into a story that had been playing out long before he arrived. As the sun slipped lower behind the trees, the air thickened with restraint on one side and authority on the other. Elijah took a step back and reached into his wallet. His hand paused not for effect but for memory. He remembered mornings standing in the freezing surf during SEAL training. Remembered hostage situations turned in seconds by calm planning. Remembered dragging a wounded teammate up a cliff in Afghanistan. Now he had returned home thinking he'd left battles behind. But here he was, in front of a gate, being asked again to prove he mattered. And he still hadn't even picked up his daughter from the party. The air had grown still, thick with the kind of silence that feels heavy. Elijah stood calmly beside his car, his hand resting on the window frame, while Karen and Brenda remained behind the booth, speaking in clipped, hushed voices. There was no reason for this to be going on so long. He had done everything right. He presented a government-issued ID. He spoke respectfully. He clearly explained he was there to pick up his 7-year-old daughter. And still, they treated him as if he were trying to slip past a border, not pulling up to a child's birthday party with fruit juice and balloons. Karen finally stepped forward. She gave Elijah a look that seemed polite on the surface, yet cold underneath. She smiled, but her lips thinned at the edges, like someone being forced to entertain something beneath them. She told him that without a confirmed call from the host family, there was nothing she could do. Brenda widened her stance beside her, folding her arms like a border guard. Still, Elijah remained steady. He explained again with patience that he had already texted Ava's mother before leaving work. He even showed them the message, her saying, "Party's in full swing. Amari's already jumping on the trampoline. Gate should let you in." Alongside it, a smiling selfie of the two girls, arms wrapped around each other, tiny fists holding cupcakes. Karen barely glanced at the message. "Anyone can type that," she said thoughtfully, almost to herself. Then she asked if he had an invitation email or any proof that his name was on a list. But Elijah hadn't brought an invitation. None had been required. Ava's mother had told all the parents that she'd call the gate ahead of time and everything would be fine. And clearly it had been fine for everyone else. The SUVs before him had passed without question. White drivers had nodded casually to Brenda and rolled through. In their direction, there had been smiles and waves, not requests for ID or database checks. Now, however, every minute that passed was another reminder that Elijah's calm tone, neat appearance, and clear explanation were not enough. The only thing that had spoken louder was the color of his skin and the make of his car. The tension had become quiet but undeniable. The visitor line behind Elijah was growing. Horns had begun to tap, not angry blares, but little annoyed reminders of time moving on. People were waiting, observing. One woman in a silver Lexus leaned out and called to Brenda, asking what was going on. Brenda called back, "Security concerns. Please be patient." But her voice sounded falsely urgent, almost rehearsed. Elijah stood there, alone in the middle of a stage he never asked to be on. And around him, unaware or uncaring, the actors played out a script that had been written long ago. Inside something hurt, not rage or violence. He had mastered those ghosts long ago. This pain was quieter. more personal. The kind that seeps in slowly, not from what's said, but from being reminded what so many people think even before you speak. He wondered silently if Brenda and Karen knew just how common this was. If they knew what it meant to prepare for things like this the way other people prepared for traffic, expected frustrations, baked into the day. And he wondered if they knew what it does to a father, to stand outside while a child waits inside, laughing under streamers and unbothered sun. His daughter Amari didn't know what was happening outside that gate. Didn't know her father was being held back, judged. And he didn't want her to. That's why he stayed solid. That's why he swallowed every urge to raise his voice or explain his worth. 2 more residents pulled up behind the line. A small group of neighbors began to get out of their cars, watching. Something about the way Elijah stood, calm and alone, had drawn their interest. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing joggers and a tennis visor, walked toward the booth. She looked at Elijah, then at Brenda. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice cautious. Brenda stepped in quickly. She explained that there was an issue with verification, and that they were trying to reach the host family. But Elijah noticed the way Brenda's tone shifted. Lighter now, polished, because someone else was listening. The woman glanced at Elijah, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe. She looked thoughtful, like she wanted to speak but didn't know what to say. Then came the second wave of trouble. Karen, still holding her radio, said they'd called the hosting family several times and would give it a few more minutes before contacting local law enforcement, just to be safe. There was no urgency in her voice, only the same slow confidence of someone sure that no real consequence would come from this misuse of fear. Elijah didn't move. He simply met her words with a long look, not aggressive, but piercing. She didn't flinch. Why should she? She had control. Elijah looked up at the sky, cloudless and pale. He thought of his daughter again. The innocence she had. The way she once colored a picture of their tiny apartment and drew hearts over it like it was a fairy tale castle. She believed her family could go anywhere, be anything. But this gate, and the women guarding it were whispering something else. They were the reminder that real-life castles have drawbridges. And sometimes the guards ask for more than a password. Sometimes they need proof of belonging that can't be written down. The tension was spreading now, not just between Brenda and Elijah, but into the crowd gathering behind them. Cell phones were raised quietly. No loud voices yet, but whispers had begun. "Why's he being held up? He gave her ID. I saw it from here. This is taking way too long." The story was slipping out of the hands of those who thought they held it. Cameras tilt power. They bear witness. Elijah stayed still, steady, unmoved. But even he felt his chest tighten, not from threat, but from heartbreak. That this was still his burden. That, after all the honor, hard work, and silent sacrifices, his presence still confused people who believed this level of control made them safe. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made demands. And yet somehow, to them, his calm was seen as tension. His presence misread as force. In the distance, a birthday balloon floated skyward from behind a house's roof, its ribbon dancing in the breeze. Elijah watched it rise, his mind thousands of miles away. Underwater training, parachutes over deserts, rescue missions no one knew he had done. A whole life spent protecting strangers. And now, he couldn't even get through a gate to bring his daughter home. By now, everything that should have taken 60 seconds had stretched into nearly 20 minutes. Elijah still stood beside his car, eyes calm, posture steady. He hadn't moved much, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown frustration, because he knew too well how any sudden emotion from someone who looked like him could be twisted and weaponized in seconds. Brenda and Karen seemed uninterested in the rising tension around them. They remained behind the booth, murmuring to each other, occasionally glancing toward Elijah like he was a storm cloud waiting to rain. But their bubble, pretending this was just a routine check, was slowly starting to pop. The line of cars waiting behind Elijah had started to grow restless, not out of curiosity at first, but from the simple frustration of delay on a hot Saturday afternoon. At least 10 vehicles idled by now, caught in a traffic jam that had no reason to exist. People started stepping out of their cars. A teenage boy in a hoodie leaned against a bicycle, flipping open his phone. He tapped on the screen. Recording. Others followed. All it took was one eyebrow raised, one glance exchanged. People knew when something wasn't right, when something was off. There was tension in the air, but not the kind that explodes. This was quieter, more watching than shouting. Not the heat of anger, but the cold of discomfort. People had begun whispering just loud enough to be heard. A man in a blue polo told his wife, "This wouldn't be happening if he looked like me." A mother holding her toddler whispered under her breath, "This is just not okay." The energy had shifted. It was no longer just Elijah and the gate. And yet, Brenda remained stone-faced, holding on tightly to the power the booth gave her. Power handed to her by uniform, desk, and clipboard. Karen, the site manager, started to feel the weight of eyes on her. She adjusted her blazer, glanced at the growing crowd, then at Elijah. Her polite smile from earlier had faded. She reached again for her walkie-talkie, muttering something about crowd control. But her words lacked conviction now. What she and Brenda failed to understand was this. The crowd wasn't forming against Elijah. They were forming around him, a silent protective circle. People weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. Some were recording quietly. Some were just standing, observing every move, letting the discomfort build naturally into something unavoidable. Everyone could see it. Elijah wasn't the problem here. One woman, a grandmother who had once seen Elijah at a school play, stepped closer to the gate. She gave him a gentle nod, the kind that says, "I see you." He returned it quietly, not needing words. There was a shared understanding there, a quiet exchange more powerful than anything said aloud. A young white couple, dressed for a jog, said something to each other about knowing Ava's family. They had seen Elijah at past birthdays. Invited, for sure. One of them murmured, but when they approached the booth to say so, Brenda brushed them off, saying this wasn't a social matter, but a rules matter. Rules, of course, were now being bent around assumptions. The comments came in waves, subtle, nervous murmurs tangled in disbelief. He's just trying to pick up his daughter. He showed ID. What else do they want? This just feels wrong. Are they really calling the cops? And still, Elijah stood there, completely still, grounded, present. Not because he wasn't feeling something deep and sharp. He was, but his silence was part of something greater. It was a shield, a message. His posture told the world there was no threat here, only the weight of years being carried, once again quietly. Elijah had learned long ago that silence can be louder than shouting. That patience, held long enough, drew attention that anger never could. And the crowd was learning that too. They were starting to feel it. Not just the unfairness of the moment, but the long shadow of something bigger. Nobody had asked Elijah where he worked, or what he did, or who he really was. The decisions were made based on a quick glance at his skin, his car, and a story that had been rehearsed in the minds of people like Brenda long before he even showed up that day. He kept his focus ahead, gazing past the iron gate as if envisioning the moment when he would finally step through and see his daughter's face. Inside the neighborhood, music from the backyard party floated faintly over the trees. Children's laughter drifted through like a haunting contrast to the scene at the guard booth. Elijah thought about Amari, how she'd probably already eaten cake, how she might now be looking toward the street, wondering why he hadn't shown up yet. This wasn't just about him anymore. It rarely ever was. By now, online viewers had joined the impromptu crowd. A few live streams had started from phones at the rear of the line. Comments raced across the screens. "This is unreal?" He told them why he's there. "This is so wrong. They're blocking a dad from picking up his daughter? Just say it. They don't think he belongs because he's black." Someone tweeted a clip from their dashcam. It showed the full interaction, time-stamped with the caption, "Doing this to a calm black father in front of his own daughter. It never ends." The clip was already gaining traction. Karen noticed, her arms folded tighter, eyes darting. She seemed unsure now, her tone having lost its steadiness. Brenda, on the other hand, looked agitated, muttering about the need for rules and order. But the authority they held was crumbling under the weight of cameras, questions, and truth. Because when truth stands still long enough, people begin to see around the lies. Karen would glance at her phone soon. She'd see what was happening beyond the gate, on timelines in neighborhoods across states miles away. But for now, she still clung to procedure, even as its meaning dissolved with each new set of eyes turning to the scene. Elijah remained rooted in the moment. He could have left. He could have made a call. He could have pushed harder. But he didn't, because this pause, this patience, this crowd was becoming something more powerful than rage. It was evidence, not just for today, but maybe for all the fathers, brothers, sons who had no cameras when they stood at gates of their own. He stood not in defiance, but in dignity. And now, for the first time that day, the power they tried to press on him wasn't just theirs anymore. It was shifting, and everyone could feel it. The shift didn't come with a bang, but with a crack in the tone, a change in posture, a hesitation barely visible, an unraveling that started in Karen's expression the moment she realized people were no longer just watching but remembering. The crowd continued to grow. 3 people had started live streams. Others angled phones just low enough not to seem aggressive but high enough to catch Brenda's stiff shoulders, Karen's uncertain eyes, and, most importantly, Elijah's quiet strength. The online feeds were filling with comments now, viewers from across the city and beyond chiming in. Elijah had not said much. He had asked no one to film. He hadn't once raised his voice. It wasn't his silence that was drawing attention. It was what his silence exposed. Then, something subtle happened. Elijah reached into his wallet again. But this time, it wasn't to present a driver's license or a text message. He didn't need those anymore. The people watching didn't need another proof of purpose. And Karen, well, she wasn't demanding paperwork anymore. She had grown quieter with every minute of a camera recording her still denying entry to a composed black father in front of a school full of parents. Elijah took out a card. Firm, matte black. Without a word, he held it out toward Karen. She didn't take it right away. Her hesitation said everything. Authority had been hers for nearly half an hour. Unquestioned, shared between her and Brenda in layers of defensiveness and protocol. But now, under a lens both literal and social, she hesitated to grab what she couldn't control. At last, she read the name. Elijah D. Ross. Beneath it, no title. Just a small embossed seal, gold-glinting, unmistakable to those who knew it. She read the name again, then a third time, because everything about her role in this story had been built on who she assumed he was. And now, this small, unassuming card was shaking that ground beneath her feet. She glanced up at him, intent, composed, giving nothing away. Then she turned the card over, and her eyes caught something she didn't expect. A line of small text beneath a symbol that looked like military insignia. The badge wasn't loud. It didn't shout rank or weapon or threat. But to anyone who knew, it spoke volumes. And someone in the crowd did. A man behind the camera gasped quietly. Wait, that's a SEAL badge. Others heard. The whisper trickled like water splitting stone. A woman in running shoes leaned toward her partner, eyes wide. He's military? Not just military. Elijah Ross had served quietly, without fanfare, across continents most people couldn't point to on a map. He had led missions to save civilians from rebel fire, pulled injured teammates from under burning steel. His strength had always been quiet, precise, focused. And here he was, being blocked from a child's birthday party because of a gatekeeper's hunch and a community manager's hesitation. Karen's hands suddenly couldn't stay still. She handed the card back quickly, like it burned. She began to stammer something that sounded almost like an apology, but it came out broken and heavy. Too late. Elijah wasn't asking for their respect. He didn't even need them to look embarrassed. That moment passed a long time ago. What he was showing them had nothing to do with being flashy. It had to do with truth. Not just truth for him, but for what this scene had become. Because now the cameras had caught it all. The respectful approach. The long, fruitless wait. The growing crowd. The trust broken not by behavior, tone, or action, but by skin and assumption. Karen and Brenda had made themselves the main characters of a story they never imagined would be recorded. But a story like this never stays inside a gate. The woman from property management arrived shortly after. A sharp black SUV pulled up without warning, rolling to a smooth stop just behind Karen. No flashing lights, no sirens, just clean corporate calm. Out stepped a small, sharply dressed woman holding a folder. She walked with purpose, her heels tapping against the pavement like a slow drumbeat. Her blazer bore the silver pin of the property development company that operated Riverside Estates. Sarah Chin, regional director, not just staff but decision-making power in the flesh. She scanned the scene. Dozens of residents out of their cars. Phones raised, conversations buzzing. And at the center, Elijah. Tall, dignified, still not a word spoken in pride or protest. Sarah approached him, stopping just shy of the gate. She knew immediately who he was. There was no confusion in her eyes. No delay. She greeted him with deference. The kind of quiet, professional respect given only when someone holds weight behind the scenes. She extended a hand gently, whispered something private. Maybe a regret, maybe just a name. Elijah only nodded. That was when the crowd truly shifted. Because Sarah turned and addressed Karen. Not cruelly, not loudly, but with full, clear authority. Her words were firm, controlled. Not a reprimand in voice, but in presence. What she represented was enough. The organization itself standing at the scene they now had to answer for. It became evident, painfully so, that Elijah Ross wasn't just someone's dad from out of town. He was a stakeholder, funder, one of the lead veterans who had invested in the very project that created Riverside Estates. He didn't boast about it. That wasn't his style. But people around him began piecing it together. A quiet war hero, now turned entrepreneur, who had contributed to accessible housing, to veterans' job training, to family-first policies across state developments. A man who had helped build what this community had become, and yet was turned away at the threshold because he didn't look like the kind of investor they imagined. Suddenly, the cameras weren't recording a standoff anymore. They were recording the turning. The moment a black man, disrespected and profiled, slowly unfolded his quiet power. Not in anger, but in grace. Not through yelling, but by standing. Long enough, truthful enough, seen clearly enough. Karen no longer spoke. Brenda looked down and began fidgeting with paperwork that no longer mattered. And Sarah? She reached into her bag and pulled out a press folder, containing community ethics protocols, and handed it to Karen without a word. The information had always existed. The morality they should have leaned on had always been there, tucked into handbooks and policies. But they had ignored it because they assumed no one important, no one powerful would look like Elijah. They were wrong. And now, the story wasn't theirs to explain anymore. It belonged to the people watching, the people filming, the thousands who would hear about the father simply arriving to pick up his daughter, and what the world tried to tell him about his place, before he reminded it otherwise. It wasn't the card that changed everything. Not fully. It wasn't the sleek design, or the embossed crest, or even the quiet reverence with which Sarah Chun treated Elijah as she stepped out of the company SUV. No, the card was just a symbol, a spark. The real power in that moment was how everything began to make sense for everyone watching. Like the final piece of a puzzle slipping into place, revealing a picture people hadn't expected but couldn't look away from. Because from the start, they had looked at Elijah through narrowed eyes, a filter of assumption built from stories that never really fit someone like him. Too calm to be angry, too composed to be criminal, too patient to be a threat. What did they see? A man who didn't look like he belonged in their gated world. But now everything shifted. The people behind the phones? Their expressions changed first. Some gasped, mouths falling open. Others placed hands over their hearts, eyes blinking as understanding settled in heavily. One by one, they realized who they'd been filming. Not just a father wronged, but a man of serious weight. A protector, a contributor, a builder of communities. It wasn't just that Elijah was a Navy SEAL, though that part had its own gravity. It was that he was the investor, Not invited to the neighborhood, he was part of the reason it existed. He wasn't just a name on a guest list. He was a name on the company's board. The woman in the tennis visor who had questioned things earlier now stepped back, almost stunned into silence. The older man behind her slowly put his phone down, blinking quickly as he recognized the name from a community newsletter that once arrived in his mailbox but never seemed important enough to read fully. For years, Elijah Ross had stayed behind the scenes, giving quietly, guiding decisions from a boardroom instead of behind a microphone. He was the kind of person who believed impact mattered most when it didn't need applause. Now all of that was revealed, not by force, not by demand, but by necessity. Because silence can only protect for so long before truth makes itself visible. Karen, the community manager who had for 40 long minutes stood between a father and his child, turned colorless. Her voice, once sharp with certainty, had evaporated. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but there were no words left to spin. No policy manual, no rule about callbacks not being answered, could explain away how she had challenged the very man signing off on development plans each fiscal year. Brenda, who just an hour ago had puffed up with false authority over a clipboard and a uniform, now stiffened into something small. Her guard booth fortress suddenly looked fragile, its windows too transparent, its assumed power melted by exposure. As realization dropped like weight over them all, Elijah said nothing. That was his consistent strength, his knowing. He had watched injustice unfold so many times before this day, not always against himself. But every time it struck, it left a cut somewhere. Some wounds healed, others built character. This moment didn't call for punishment, called for reckoning. Sarah Chun, standing at Elijah's side, wasn't just embarrassed. She looked devastated. As the regional director, she wasn't prepared to see one of their key community partners humiliated by the very process their company often celebrated as welcoming and inclusive. She knew what this meant, what the video already sweeping across the internet would become. This was no longer minor misconduct. This was a breach of names, values, and faces they claimed to support. Sarah immediately began making calls, not to cover up or mitigate, but to start what they should have done earlier: accountability. She turned to Elijah with quiet, seeking eyes. The cameras caught none of what was said between them in hushed tones. But years later, residents would talk about the sheer control of that moment. No shouting, no triumph, just a temperature shift in the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. And somewhere in the distance, little footsteps came bouncing down the sidewalk. Elijah turned then, finally leaving his place of quiet watch. Past the lines of residents, the overheated driveway, past the booth that had once dared to cage dignity. There she was. Amari ran into view, pink ribbons flapping from her braids, a chocolate stain on her cheek from cake she had gotten too excited to eat politely. Her arms opened wide before she spoke a word. Elijah bent to meet her in the middle. It was the first time since arriving that his face softened fully. He lifted her effortlessly, hugging her like gravity meant nothing. She pressed her cheek to his and started talking rapidly, about cupcakes, streamers who had cried during musical chairs. She didn't notice the crowd, didn't see the faces. She only saw Daddy, the very person the gate said didn't belong. Behind them, the air had stopped moving. Brenda remained at her post, no longer typing. Karen turned and walked away slowly, as if she had aged in the last 5 minutes. The tension had drained out of them, replaced with something heavier: consequence. And slowly, like a tide receding, the crowd began to shift too. Some applauded gently, others nodded in reverence. A few looked down, ashamed by their earlier silence. The cameras, they were still rolling, but now they captured something deeper than confrontation. They captured humility growing where pride once stood. They captured faces reflecting on how quickly assumption had become accusation, and how easily dignity shattered when no one stopped to question their own bias. The video, when shared later, wouldn't just be a clip of a man proving his worth. It would be a turning point, a mirror, 1,000 quiet reckonings held up to a society built on first impressions and unequal thresholds. A week later, an email would go out to every resident of Riverside Estates. A rare one, marked urgent, community policy update. But it wouldn't come from Karen. It would come from Sarah Chin. Attached would be the video unedited. Alongside it, a message. This happened on our watch. It should never have happened at all. We owe more than an apology, we owe change. But in that moment, in the warmth of his daughter's arms, Elijah didn't think of reforms or repercussions. He didn't think about Brenda and Karen or even the eyes fixed on him. He thought about Amari's laughter, about how he would make sure she remembered the party, not the gate, about how, even now, his strength was not in power but in peace. That was the real reveal. Not that he was a Navy SEAL, not that he was an investor, but that he could stand in the middle of a storm and still choose to walk through it, instead of returning what the world tried to give him. By the time Monday morning arrived, the story had already traveled far beyond the gates of Riverside Estates. What began as a quiet confrontation at a neighborhood guard booth became a national headline over the weekend. First a few thousand shares, then 50,000, then millions. The video rippled through social media like wildfire through dry leaves, burning through layers of denial and excuse. It wasn't just the injustice that moved people. It was the unwavering calm of Elijah Ross, the image of a father blocked from seeing his daughter, standing quietly and respectfully while absurd accusations hung in the air around him. No shouts, no begging, just a man standing tall in the face of something ugly and familiar. And then the reveal, his background, his badge, his name. He was everything they didn't expect. Decorated, invested, essential. But it should never have taken credentials for a man to be treated with decency. That's what struck deepest. In boardrooms and law offices around the country, the video was being dissected, not as entertainment but as evidence. Evidence of what happens every day in different ways, often unseen. Elijah's story had become a symbol, a painful summary of what needed correcting. Not just at Riverside Estates, but across thousands of neighborhoods, buildings, workplaces, and institutions. Sarah Chin didn't sleep much that Sunday evening. She had spent the entire day in meetings. Legal counsel, public relations, community outreach. Every conversation carried the weight of what they had allowed to happen under their company banner. As the regional director for Magnolia Property Group, she was responsible for more than 80 gated communities. The shame spilled beyond that one driveway. By dawn Monday, she'd signed off on two major decisions. The first was immediate termination. Brenda, the security booth attendant, received a letter from corporate she would later describe as sharp but fair. It wasn't just that she questioned Elijah Ross. It was her pattern. A history quietly logged of selective enforcement and biased reports that no one had bothered to review until now. That neglect was systemic and she had been the symptom, not the root. Karen Walsh, community manager, was placed on indefinite leave under investigation. The damage she had caused with assumptions and pride wasn't just personal. It had risked investor confidence, public trust, and legal accountability. Karen had always seen herself as the keeper of rules, but the world now saw what happened when rules met prejudice. Dressed up in a blazer and a pleasant voice. Internal policies that had remained untouched for years were now peeling under new scrutiny. Background checks on staff were expanded. Diversity and bias training programs, once optional and loosely attended, were now mandatory at every level, hourly worker to executive. There was no waiting, no delayed rollouts. Action followed exposure. But Sarah knew that true accountability went deeper. So the second decision she made was about rebuilding trust. At Elijah's request, not as a demand, but with quiet clarity, a formal community meeting was planned for that Friday. Not a PR event, not damage control, a reckoning. When Elijah entered the hall, dressed in a simple navy shirt and worn jeans, there were more eyes on him than ever. But the gaze had shifted. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was respect. Uncertain, humbled, almost apologetic. Residents filled the room. Some nodded silently. Others came forward to shake his hand, not because of his title or uniform, but because they knew now what they hadn't seen before. They'd watched the video a dozen times. Each time it stung deeper. One by one they shared gratitude and guilt. for watching quietly, for hesitating, for enjoying the privilege of never being questioned. Then, near the end of the meeting, it was Elijah's turn to speak. He didn't try to shame anyone. He didn't list offenses or call for names. Instead, he talked about Amari, about what it meant to her to live in a world where her father could be told he didn't belong. He spoke plainly, firmly, not with fire, but with depth. He asked the crowd to imagine what it's like to know that your good character has never been enough. He asked them to imagine being stopped, silenced, dismissed by people who would later pretend they were just doing their job. And he asked them calmly to tell a better story with their actions moving forward. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the meeting ended, not everyone clapped right away. It was the kind of silence that follows truth, uncomfortable, necessary. Afterward, Elijah walked through the corridor where company representatives were meeting privately. There were lawyers there. Voices were low, terse. What happened to Elijah wasn't just a headline. It was a liability, a clear violation of company ethics, human respect, and possibly civil law. Lawyers, PR professionals, crisis managers, they all wanted to head off lawsuits. But Elijah wasn't interested in payouts. He didn't want compensation. He wanted correction. The moments that followed became historic within the company. Not because of anything Elijah demanded, but how calmly and firmly he outlined change. He sat at the table, folders in hand, and presented guidelines for the communities the company managed. Standards informed by educators, military ethics, and community builders. Gate protocols with transparency. Bias retraining every 6 months. Diverse hiring panels. A new equity oversight committee, one with the power to audit internal bias patterns. Quiet suggestions drawn from years of patience. Everyone at the table listened. And then, unexpectedly, someone from the legal team, an older white man in a suit who had likely spent his career thinking in terms of risk and liability, leaned forward. He said 5 words that became the spine of their follow-up plan. "We have to be better." Those words, simple as they were, carried weight. Elijah nodded. By the following month, press releases went out. Not to market redemption, but to acknowledge failure. Editors praised the transparency. News outlets followed the updates, no longer calling it simply Elijah's story, but referring to it as a national turning point. A case study taught in company trainings and business schools focused on ethical operations. Elijah never made the headlines after that. That was the way he preferred it. He went back to being Amari's dad. The one who volunteered at school assemblies, who sat in the back row during recitals, who helped fix neighbors' screen doors on weekends. But what had changed didn't need his constant spotlight. Because systems were moving now, slowly but surely. He didn't want revenge. He wanted reform. And thanks to the quiet power he held, grace intact even in humiliation, the world was learning the difference. Change, real change, doesn't come with applause. It doesn't wear a suit or carry a microphone. It arrives silently, brick by brick, heart by heart, in the long quiet moments when no one is watching. Not because the world is demanding it, but because someone, somewhere, refuses to leave the world the way they found it. The events at the Riverside Estates security gate had already passed into memory by the time the real reform began. But the echoes remained. Over the following months, the community itself transformed. Not in flashy ways, there were no banners or slogans, no grand unveilings. Instead, it reshaped in subtle but lasting shifts, the kind that made people pause and consider, the kind that reached the bones of the system. One of the first changes came through a new policy. Every visitor, regardless of race, car, dress, or demeanor, would be met with the same protocol. No fast passes for familiar faces. No extra hoops for those who simply didn't fit the mold. Residents noticed the difference immediately. Some resisted quietly. Change always invites discomfort. But others embraced it, finally seeing what equal footing could really look like. Then came the training, deeper, more honest training than the brief sensitivity modules most corporations used to keep lawsuits at bay. This was real, lived, facilitated by educators, veterans, community builders, activists, and even psychologists who taught how bias embeds not just in systems, but in muscle memory, in breath, in silence between sentences. Staff were asked to reflect, not repeat. New hires came in with fresh eyes and stronger ethics. Not just for show, but because the standard had changed. The entire hiring process shifted to prioritize diverse panels and transparent practices, reviewing backgrounds for patterns that could no longer be ignored or hidden. A new department, Equity and Community Safety, was formed under the Magnolia Property Group. Not just another HR branch, but a small team tasked with building connections across races, incomes, and cultures within the communities they managed. Their mission wasn't to enforce, but to listen. Elijah had declined every offer to lead it. He didn't need the title or the office. He offered guidance instead, quietly, whenever it was needed. He met with the team a few times per month and helped design materials, review strategies, and offer one-on-one mentorship. Some people didn't even know he was involved, and that was exactly the kind of quiet power he believed in. Amari kept growing. She played on the neighborhood basketball team, made it to a county-wide spelling bee, and proudly told her teacher her dad had fixed a broken gate with no tools. In her own little way, she was telling the story, passing it along like a folded note in a classroom. Not every conversation in the neighborhood was easy. There were pushbacks, moments where neighbors looked uncomfortable discussing what happened that day. Some new residents moved in unaware, while others came because of how the community had chosen to respond, with truth, not defensiveness. But shifts could be seen in small things. A teenage boy, once the same one who recorded the live stream, started a diversity club at school. He titled it More Than They See. Brenda's Replacement? A black woman named Maya, soft-spoken and thorough, who treated every visitor with the same blend of courtesy and caution. Karen never reapplied for her position. Last anyone heard, she was pursuing a career shift, possibly into mediation. The video, still circulating online months later, had been picked up for legal ethics classes, social justice programs, and media studies. Professors used it to ask students what moments held power. Was it when Elijah showed his badge? Or was it the moment he didn't flinch under pressure? Everyone had a different answer, but they all agreed something in it had changed them. Occasionally, reporters reached out to Elijah. He politely turned all requests down, except for one, a small podcast run by veterans transitioning into civilian life. He appeared in a quiet episode and spoke about the difference between authority and leadership. He never mentioned the incident by name, but everyone who listened understood who he was. And every so often, Sarah Chun would check in with him, not as a company rep anymore, but as someone who had once been spared from blindness by the dignity of another. She made it her mission to ensure the policy stayed active, not just in spirit but in practice. Riverside Estates began to be known for something beyond its gates. Not its houses or schools, but its choice to evolve. A local newspaper, not long ago silent, followed up a year later with a headline that read, "From Division to Dignity. One father's quiet stand left a neighborhood forever changed." And they were right, because that gate, the same one that once refused Elijah entry, now had something new. It wasn't fancy, just a brass plate, mounted at elbow height, barely shining. Etched into it were the words, "Every person has a place here. Let them in." People walked by it daily. Some noticed, some didn't. But Amari, every time she passed by it on the way to school, reached out her fingers and brushed the edge like it was a secret melody only she could hear. The wound had not vanished, but it had become something else. Proof that harm can be met with strength, and strength does not need to roar to be heard. Elijah returned to his life quietly, coaching a youth track team, volunteering at the local library. He remained someone who didn't need to hold power out front. He simply carried it within and let the world respond to its light. And maybe that's where the greatest justice was found, not in punishment but in progress. Not in making noise but in moving mountains one stone at a time. For anyone who has ever stood on the outside of a gate, met not with welcome, but with warning, Elijah's story is a reminder. You are not their first assumption. You are not what fear tries to paint you as. You are more. And somewhere, somehow, the world will be made to see it. Thanks for experiencing this story. If you've ever been judged before saying a single word, if you believe in quiet strength, and if you know that dignity should never depend on how someone looks, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts. We want to hear your voice. Let them in.